Filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky once said, "When a person is just born, they are weak and flexible. When they die, they are hard and insensitive. When a tree is growing, it's tender and pliant, but when it's dry and hard, it dies. Hardness and strength are death's companions. Pliancy and weakness are expressions of the freshness of being. Because what has hardened will never win." Identity has always been a key element of the global cinematic oeuvre. Even films that do not deal directly with questions of identity at some level embody them. Is the audience meant to identify with a character? Or maybe the camera as a literal proxy for their eyes? What is the identity of the film itself? How does the film perform that identity? One of the most basic elements of cinematic language is the cut. Almost all films are assemblages composed of smaller scenes. Good editors know that humans tend to see relationships or meanings when two images are juxtaposed via a cut. We can make the argument, then, that films have an identity that is fractured, situated in time, and ontologically discontinuous. It is my opinion that film is a real-world allegory for the sort of fractured, permanently partial identities posited by theorists like Donna, Haraway, and Gilles Deleuze. In her 1985 essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway posits the emergence of a cyborg identity. While this includes discourse about science fiction bogeymen and actual medical prosthesis, the nature of her theory has more to do with the play of permanently partial identities in an increasingly connected and chaotic world. While the rest of this song plays out, I would like to present some quotes from the article before we delve into their implications on identity in our neoliberal paradigm and the way I perceive them connecting to film theory. This is an argument for pleasure and the confusion of boundaries and for responsibility in their construction. It is also an effort to contribute to socialist feminist culture and theory in a postmodernist, non-naturalist mode, and in the utopian tradition of imagining a world without gender, which is perhaps a world without genesis, but maybe also a world without end. The cyborg is resolutely committed to partiality, irony, intimacy, and perversity. It is oppositional, utopian, and completely without innocence. Our best machines are made of sunshine. They are light and clean because they are nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of a spectrum. And these machines are eminently portable, mobile. People are nowhere near so fluid, being both material and opaque. Cyborgs are ether, quintessence. Unlike the hopes of Frankenstein's monster, the cyborg does not expect its father to save it through a restoration of the garden. That is, through the fabrication of a heterosexual mate. Our bodies, ourselves. Bodies are maps of power and identity. Cyborgs are no exception. A cyborg body is not innocent. It was not born in a garden. It does not seek unitary identity and so generate antagonistic dualisms without end, or until the world ends. It takes irony for granted. Cyborg writing is about the power to survive, not on the basis of original innocence, but on the basis of seizing the tools to mark the world that marked them as other. The tools are often stories, retold stories, versions that reverse and displace the hierarchical dualisms of naturalized identities. In retelling origin stories, cyborg authors subvert the control myths of origin of Western culture. We have all been colonized by those origin myths, with their longing for fulfillment and apocalypse. So in this article, Donna Haraway gives us a framework for a new sort of identity, a cyborg identity. A cyborg identity is by definition incomplete and without origin. Haraway claims that to seek a unitary and stable identity is to put oneself on a path to destruction or erasure. Likewise, a society that attempts to return to the Garden of Paradise, aka a unitary, phallocentric, naturalized conception of perfection or wholeness, posits nothing but its own apocalypse as it is portrayed in the Great Western origin myth from Genesis to Revelation. A cyborg identity, therefore, is not a lack of identity, but an identity that is partial, multitudinous, and in a symbiotic relationship with the other myriad identities around it. Haraway speaks of the embarrassed silence that often happens when radical discourses intersect. Contradictions of identity extend into even the most radically inclusive of politics. Thus we have the multiplicity of feminisms, the historic omission of women of color in many feminist circles, TERF feminism, the various factions within the LGBTQ+ community, the emerging factions in disability studies, etc. The cyborg perspective is to step back and appreciate the fundamental chaos that is identity, to recognize its fluidity, and to embrace the identities of those around us. This is a fundamentally ironic stance, and can often seem confusing as ontological beliefs and systems of morality clash. But confusion is not necessarily a bad thing, as states of confusion often lead to the greatest breakthroughs. The fragmentary and discontinuous nature of cyborg ontology is reminiscent to me of the way that movies operate. A photograph has more or less a stable identity. Movies, on the other hand, are fractious and destabilized. They juxtapose moving images through time. A movie in itself is not confusing in the way Donna Haraway means when she uses the word, though. To come to a closer allegory to the confusion of images or identities, we would have to intercut movies that have radically different identities. In the background, I've had running a series of shots from various movies. The movies I selected I chose because I believe them all to be making radical statements, and all are very much situated in their identity and their perspective. Intercutting scenes this way brings no guarantee of finding significance in the interplay of these different filmic identities. The overall impression is one of confusion, as we have already discussed, but out of the confusion, new associations might arise. This sort of scene-to-scene association negates critical meaning in the traditional sense. All meaning that presents itself to the viewer is of course incidental, and thus in some way fundamental and indivisible.